What then are some of the concerns and interests of critical literacy pedagogy? Well, the first one, perhaps, is around diversity. That students come to school, they have voices, they have experiences, they have cultures, and to give those cultures in all their diversity some kind of voice in the curriculum is pretty important. Didactic pedagogy tended to want to pretend that everyone was the same and here are the rules, go away and learn them, and wasn't interested in listening to the voice of students. But also what sort of follows from that is something about agency. So people can become active participants in the world, so they can become citizens. So in their workplaces they can contribute constructively to team discussions, for instance, and do that on the basis of who they are, on the basis of their identity. There's also an idea that something that might be called English is not just one English. We have in the world multiple English airs. So when we're doing literacy, it's not just one standard language, the language of the nation state or the official language, but in fact we have dialects, we have different registers based on different professions, we have global English now, and global English, the majority of speakers of English in the world now are not first language speakers. So what we encounter out there in the world is this extraordinary diversity of language use, even within English. And if one takes particular dialect forms, and one classic form which was studied first in great detail by a linguist by the name of William Labov, is African, or it was called Black English vernacular, is I think the term that he uses, African American English. Now in African American English there are a number of grammatical forms, just to give you one example, which are technically ungrammatical in some other Englishes. So when you say I ain't got no, that's a double negative, and some versions of English say that's grammatically incorrect. Now when those kids come to school and their way of speaking and their way of articulating their own language, which is nominally the same English as everybody else's, but in fact it's not, becomes something where they don't do as well because they come this acceptable form in terms of classroom English. That's a very simple example of the ways in which we need to open up the curriculum and recognise the diversity of forms even within the English language itself.
The point that I'm trying to make is that the values we hold, the diversity of our background, our life experiences all impact on meaning making. Our voice, the power we have, who we are, makes a difference in the meaning that we make and the meaning that we interpret. And even in the language that I'm speaking now, English, and the language that you might also speak, there are many ways of expressing English depending on the community that we grew up with and the purposes that we're using English. So although it seems like it's one single language, its meaning and its use can vary tremendously from individual to group. And another component that I think we need to take into account when we make meaning, which language matters, for example. English might matter in some environments, but perhaps a different language matters in a different environment. Is it valued the same way? Do we discriminate against some languages in terms of their purpose and their reason for being? How does that affect somebody who is a speaker of that language? And more recently, of course, we have new ways of communicating that have arisen from digital media, from games that we play, from texting, from the affordances of the new technology. So all these factors are important when we talk about critical pedagogy in literacy. We have to take on board who we are, how we speak, what we intend, and how we interact.
The other area that critical literacy's become very interested in recent times is digital media and, for example, things like games. So in other words, we live out there in the world where we watch YouTube, where we navigate the web, where we play video games. These are all actually forms of meaning making and forms of literacy in a much broader and more expansive sense. And they're things which are more connected to students' own lives than the traditional stuff of grammar textbooks or the traditional stuff of the literary canon, which is taught as high culture in the subject of English or English language arts. So and one of the interesting concerns of critical literacy recently is to bring more of these popular culture, new media, digital media forms into the literacy curriculum. What's the practical agenda that falls out of this? What are the implications? Well, just a couple of points that might be relevant. One is critical literacy wants to connect with lived experience, the actual lives and interests and cultures and discourse forms of the students as they come to school.
If we are to engage with literacy pedagogy from a critical point of view, we really must connect with the lived experiences of learners, to introduce them to texts from their own lives, to view texts from different perspectives. Everybody in any particular learning environment should have a right to be able to express what they think a text means. And of course, we have to unpack multiple layers of meaning in any community and negotiate what meaning means for us and for others and for the community that we're a part of.
The second thing that falls out of critical literacy as a practical agenda is just to think critically. In other words, to take the texts of the world and unpack them for their agendas, their interests and purposes. They're not just neutral. They're not just canonical literary text which we should learn because they're good for us. When we read a newspaper article, when we look at an advertisement, when we even read great canonical literature and women are placed in particular ways and men in others, and when there's differences in terms of ways in which different cultural, ethnic, racial groups are treated, we need to analyse that critically. In other words, there's no texts in the world which we can simply take at their face value. Always do critical thinking.
We then have to think critically. What patterns can we discern in different types of meaning making? Whose voice is powerful? Whose voice is not heard? Whose voice is not included? And we have to look at these patterns, at what's present and what's absent, and assemble meaning from the evidence that's available to us. And sometimes we also have to make a case for a reading that might not be obvious, for a meaning that we can bring to a text, or a meaning that we can allow others to bring to a text, which might not be the first one that we interpret ourselves.
The third aspect of critical literacy, taking it to a practical point of view, is to take action in the world. Feel as if you've got some control. Feel as if you can offer solutions. You can build text of your own. You can actually communicate things. You can build your own identity by creating meaning. So that's, if you like, a kind of a third aspect of the practical agenda of critical literacies.
And finally, if the meanings are so varied and so individualistic in some cases, how do we explain the purpose of each meaning, and how do we explain the way in which we might come to understand the different ways in which meaning is made and for what purposes? And how can we all participate in meaning making, whether it's in literature or in science or in history or indeed in any other kind of subject?